Central Video Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, and today stepping in for my normal co-host, Scott Karasik, is none other than Matt Karoly. You know him from Rod Breeder. We've had Matt multiple times on this podcast over the last couple of months, often filling in for Scott. Yeah, I was going to say something snarky, but I'll let it go. Welcome back to the show, Matt.
Hey, Aaron, thanks for having me on again. I know we got a thrilling show, a lot to talk about, so I'm looking forward to getting all this fun, exciting Falcons topics.
Absolutely. It's not like it's May and nothing is going on. We will find a way to bring you guys Falcons content, even if we have to manufacture that. And it seems like a little bit of that is being manufactured currently with the Falcons, given the recent contract extension of Matt Ryan, as well as the other talks of other players that are being discussed as potential Falcons extensions, and we'll talk about that, as well as some potential holes on the Falcons roster, and we'll answer your guys' mailbag questions as well. So let's kick things off. The big news last week was the extension that Matt Ryan signed, which was a massive 5-year, $150 million extension that keeps him locked up through 2023 season. If you guys missed it, I put a video up on the Falcon Central Radio Facebook page on Saturday. It was a 10-minute video just giving my thoughts on that whole thing. I won't necessarily go rehash that. If you want to go check that out, you can do so, but I'll give you the clip notes in a moment. But Matt, go ahead and give your thoughts on this big, massive contract that makes Matt Ryan the highest paid football player currently in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, it was the inevitable. It was something that had to get done. And with the way the quarterback contracts were going these days, the next one up was definitely going to become the next highest paid player in the league. So no surprise that Matt Ryan, given his resume, I mean, I think he definitely earns this however many month long it's going to last before the next guy up, probably Aaron Rodgers, takes over that mantle. But, given the fact that, he's a 4-time Pro Bowler, league MVP, taking the Falcons on a Super Bowl run, I think he deserves it. Obviously, I'm biased. I think we all, to a varying degree, are biased and believe Matt Ryan deserved to be, a Falcon for life and to get this contract. But he's the reason that for the last 10 years, this team, this organization has even been relevant and has been competitive year in and year out. So you had to reward the guy, and I couldn't be more excited for him. And, as he said in his speech, the best is yet to come, he believes, and I truly believe that as well. And now that we got this big money ticket out the way, the rest of the puzzle pieces can fall into place, and we can start focusing on re-signing some of these younger guys from the last few draft classes.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. The cliff notes is it was sort of a necessary move for the Falcons. I think certainly it will affect the Falcons' ability to pay some certain guys, not necessarily the core players as some people refer it as, but it will sort of affect their ability to maybe pay some of those mid-tier guys that in normal circumstances might have been up for a second contract. Maybe we'll discuss a few of those guys a little bit later, as opposed to some of the top-end guys. But obviously I think the long-term is a net positive for the Falcons because you have to have a high-level quarterback to compete at the highest levels in this league. And, I think gone are the days of the Trent Dilfer type of quarterbacks that you can sort of win despite not having a high-level quarterback. I think the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2017 sort of showed us the limits of that, as well as some other teams that didn't quite make it all the way to the big game. But I think with Matt Ryan under fold, locked up for at least another 4 years, we'll sort of see where his situation is, where the team situation is when we get to, say, 2022 or so. There's probably going to be a lockout between now and then or something like that. So there's going to be a lot of things that happen in the NFL landscape. So by the time we get to the back end of that, this contract extension, a lot of things will change So sort of the Falcons will at that point sort of revisit whether or not they're going to give him a new contract, whether they're going to do what the Saints have done the last couple of years, which is basically play it by ear, year to year with Drew Brees. And the Falcons could do that where Matt Ryan's going to be about 37 years old. And so it really just sort of, the point of me all saying that is basically this contract gives the Falcons a stable foundation in which they can compete at the highest levels, presumably for the next 4 years at the very least. We'll see what happens beyond that point, but it certainly opens or reopens or widens, whatever verb you want to use, their sort of Super Bowl window over the next 4 years. And I think that's ultimately going to be very beneficial to the team as opposed to the alternative. So certainly a move that has, I think, both pros and cons, but I think definitely the pros far outweigh the cons as far as team success and all that stuff goes. Okay, let's talk about some of these other contracts that Matt discussed. Some of the other players that will get future contracts. There's been reports out there that Jake Matthews is next on deck. There's been reports that Grady Jarrett's next on deck. There's been a lot of scuttlebutt over the last week or so, couple of weeks since like the week before the draft, when Julio Jones decided that he wanted to, purge his social media, and sort of everything that he does or says or doesn't do or say has been interpreted a certain way. I'm enjoying the drama, certainly. I've certainly fanned the flames of that drama and will continue to do so until, it's no longer fun for me, which is probably going to be never. But it was interesting that we saw from ESPN, Vaughn McClure sort of wrote in an article, I think yesterday or so, that, Julio Jones is, quote unquote, appears to be angling for a raise this offseason. We sort of saw, a lot of wide receivers get paid in the last, 12 months or so since Julio signed that contract extension. I guess, Matt, I'm curious sort of, do you want to talk about the Julio drama, in air quotes drama, or do you want to talk about some of these other guys like a Jake Matthews or Grady Jarrett who may be on the sort of next rung of the ladder in terms of who's going to get paid? I'll cede the floor to you, whichever direction you want to go.
Yeah, I mean, if I can first preface with some of this Julio drama, Vaughn McClure is great. I think he's probably one of the best beat writers that we have as Falcons fans, but I think a lot of people treat him as an infallible reporter as well, and that he can do no wrong or what he says is gospel. And I think with this article that he wrote, and mind you, this was a depth chart projection article to start with, in May, no less, which, again, those should be taken with a grain of salt because a lot's going to change from now until when an actual official depth chart comes out. And even those are, sketchy at best. So if you read the article, it seems more like he's kind of speculating himself. And I don't think there's a whole lot of credence behind it. I don't think, again, I think he's taking some of these reports that have come out earlier with the social media, and he's kind of, human nature, obviously, he's curious now himself because Julio hasn't been around the facility pretty much all summer or, spring. And he's kind of just thinking, oh, well, all these contracts coming up, Matt Ryan just got his big contract. So obviously, Julio Jones should be in line because he is the best receiver in the league. He needs to get that type of contract. So, I want to say pump the brakes on all this. I still think it's nothing until we hear something from Julio, which I think is unlikely because he's not that type of guy. I would say it's a whole bunch of malarkey, and, that's my viewpoint. But obviously, as you're saying, you're going to enjoy this. You're going to keep fanning the flames. So I'm going to let you do you on that. But
okay.
I guess then to turn the page on some of these actual contract situations that are meaningful and something that a team rep, Thomas Dimitroff, had even mentioned with Jake Matthews and Grady Jarrett being the next guys in line. I guess just to spitball some ideas that I've thought that those two guys might be looking at for potential contracts. I know before the free agency period kicked off, I had pegged kind of Jake Matthews in that 12 to $13 million range. I had looked at Riley Reif's contract from Minnesota that he got before last season, kind of as the benchmark or the jumping off point. So that's where I was initially at with him, and then you get a guy like Nate Solder from New England jumping to the New York Giants and getting paid $15.5 million a year, which took him made him the highest paid tackle in the league. Nate Solder, no disrespect to Nate Solder, but he's not at that level. I wouldn't even put him in the top 8 tackles in the league if I was making a list. So that kind of throws a curveball into the whole plan with Jake Matthews, because I think Jake Matthews is definitely on Nate Solder's level. So now Jake and his agent now have a negotiating point to say, well, here's this contract that this guy got. My client is on that same level. So that's probably what he's going to start at. And, we'll see, if the Falcons want to play hardball on that. But that could be a very real possibility where Jake's earning $15 to $16 million a year, which is scary. But, I mean, it is what it is. You got to pay your blindside protectors in this league. It's one of the premium positions. So, even though Jake's probably not at a Pro Bowl level, he is more than serviceable. He's durable, and he's someone that you know what you're getting from him. As opposed to dipping into the draft pool and trying to replace him. So he's probably going to get his money, and it's probably going to be something around that 15 million range now with this Nate Solder contract. And as far as Grady Jarrett, I had, again, before free agency kicked off, had thought he'd be in like the 14 million a year ballpark, which I guess is around what Jarrell Casey's making, who's the kind of the 5th highest paid at his position. But if Grady continues to play the way he's playing, I mean, I think it can only go up. So, he's the type of guy where I would like to get a deal done before the season started, just to save a few dollars in that regard. But we'll see what his representation decides to do or decides to push. Maybe he wants to bet on himself, which, I wouldn't blame him because I think he would live up to that.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. I'm going to circle back to Julio Jones for a second. In all seriousness, though, I don't expect the Falcons to really sort of entertain giving Julio any more money, at least for a significant amount of time, just because they have some of these other guys coming up on contracts. Julio's got 3 more years left on his deal. Like, the earliest I would expect them to really sort of maybe approach it is after the 2019 season, when Julio's like 30 years old or something like that. So I don't expect, we might hear more talk about Julio wanting to get paid. I think certainly when you look at some of the guys that are now making more money than Julio Jones, I think it's kind of, you can certainly make a case. Certainly Julio's agent, I know, will be making this case to anybody that person can talk to over the next 24 months, that he is very much underpaid compared to some of these other guys like a Sammy Watkins, like a Jarvis Landry, like a Davante Adams. And so I'll say that. Well, what will become of the Julio thing? I think it'll just be something that people will talk about, and because Atlanta, no offense to the city of Atlanta or their media, but it's not necessarily a great sort of, at least as far as the sports media goes, at least when it comes to covering the Falcons, isn't necessarily upper tier compared to some of the other NFL cities out there. And so minor things tend to get blown up into bigger deals than probably what they really deserve, just because so little drama tends to happen in Atlanta. So it seems like certain things get blown up out of proportion. I expect Julio will be part of it, and certainly I will contribute to that, as I said earlier. As for Jake Matthews, yeah, you're right. The Solder deal sort of really blew the left tackle market out of the water, particularly not only with his annual per year, but his guarantee money, which I think is about 35, when the guys that are sort of immediately below him were signing for closer to something in the 20 to 25 million in terms of guaranteed money range. And so ultimately, with the Falcons, I think in an ideal situation, they could have been like, okay, Jake Matthews, we'll give you 16 million a year, but we're only going to have like 20 of that guaranteed just because you've had a little bit of injury history and whatnot. And so we don't necessarily want to, not to say that he's in the same boat as Sam Baker, but we don't necessarily want to, contribute gobs and gobs of money to a guy that may not necessarily be 100% for 16 weeks out of the season. But with the Solder deal, it kind of really makes that really difficult to basically approach him and say, okay, we'll give you 16 million, but you're only going to get 22 guaranteed or something like that. So it'll be an interesting negotiation, and because of that, I don't necessarily expect it to go quickly. If it's a deal that the Falcons want to get done before training camp, we'll sort of see what the timetable is for that. Obviously, I think it could go a lot quicker if they basically say, okay, we'll just give you like 5% more than what Nate Solder got, and I'm sure Jake Matthews and his representation will happily accept that. But if they want to try to, get that's in the best case interest for the Falcons, I think, obviously that's going to be a little bit longer of a negotiation. As for whether Jake Matthews is worth it, I've said before on other podcasts that I do that I think Jake Matthews, probably hasn't lived up to his draft status in terms of what people see as a top 10 left tackle. But I think when you look at the type of player that Jake Matthews is and was when he came out of Texas A&M, I think by and large he's the best version of that player that he possibly could be at this time. There's certain pass rushers that give him a little bit more trouble. I mean, Everson Griffin probably is still living in his nightmares even to this day from that game this past season. But it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, he's going to have struggles against some of the top tier edge rushers that really, can bull rush him and sort of expose that weakness that he has. I expect Myles Garrett to give him a lot of trouble when we face the Browns this year. But looking at some of the other pass rushers, Terrell Suggs will show some veteran savvy and probably work him over a little bit. But outside of like 3 or 4 matchups, and we saw this last year, I think for the most part, Jake does a pretty good, if not great job at that spot. And so I think ultimately he gets a lot of flack for basically being a player that I don't think people, it's a lot of issues with a lot of players. I think a lot of flack that guys get because, Ricardo Allen a couple of years ago got a lot of flack because he wasn't Earl Thomas. And it was like, Earl Thomas is like a first ballot Hall of Famer. Of course he's not Earl Thomas, but Ricardo Allen's pretty good for the player that he is. And I think Jake Matthews is sort of the same way. No, he's not, Joe Thomas. He's not, Jason Peters or anything like that. He's probably not even Taylor Lewan, but like for what he is, I think he's really good at that. And so I think it makes a lot of sense, particularly when you consider that 4 of the 5 starters the Falcons have up front are over the age of 30. You kind of need to lock up one of those spots long term because, for 80% of our starting offensive line could be replaced in the next 2 years. So I think getting Jake done makes sense, even if you have to overpay a little bit and overpay for the premium of the position. As for Grady Jarrett, I think sort of where his I wouldn't expect the contract to get done before the season. That's my guess. I would expect it more likely to get done in the middle of the season or right after the season and be the top priority between, say, October and March. And if he's not able to get that long-term deal done, I would expect the Falcons to franchise tag him. I think he'll probably be in that sort of money. And so it'll be interesting to sort of see if the Falcons go ahead and pay him that Jarrell Casey $16 million plus up there with the Fletcher Coxes, and we'll see what Aaron Donald's market, because assuming Aaron Donald will sign a deal this summer at some point, the expectation is, and sort of where that pushes the market. So, I'm not expecting a Grady Jarrett deal to get done anytime soon. I certainly could be wrong about that, but I think eventually he'll get a deal done. It's just a matter of timing, and so at some point in the next 10 months, we'll see something happen. All right, Matt, who do you think after those guys, or do you have any thoughts on anything I just said if you want to follow up before we move on to some of the other candidates that might get extensions in the next 10 to 12 months?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Okay. So, okay, let's assume that Jake Matthews gets done. Let's assume that Grady Jarrett gets done. Let's assume that whatever happens that needs to happen with Julio gets resolved. And who do you think is the next priority for the Falcons to get a contract extension between now and, say, I guess this time next year when typically the Falcons do their contract extensions in the summer? So you're looking at guys like Ricardo Allen, potentially, who's an unrestricted free agent next year. Tevin Coleman, who's an unrestricted free agent. You got Vic Beasley going into the final year of his contract. I believe Josh Harris is an unrestricted free agent next year, and long snappers need to make that cheddar too. You got Deion Jones, who will be entering the final year of his contract in 2019 as well. So he'll be a guy that could sort of be in the same boat that Grady Jarrett is currently, angling for an extension next summer as well. So any of those guys sort of stand out to you as top priorities for the Falcons, guys that you may look at and say, I don't think that's going to happen. I know you've been very vocal that you don't think Tevin Coleman is going to get re-signed. So I guess other than Tevin Coleman, or if you want to spend 5 minutes talking about why you don't think Tevin Coleman's going to get re-signed, again, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think, with bringing up Tevin Coleman there, I recently wrote an article at riseupbreeder.com, kind of, I had a rapid reaction to the draft and how I was pretty good with, all the picks. I thought most of them were, an A-plus effort from the Falcons front office. But the one that's still kind of eating at me a little bit is that fourth-round pick, Ito Smith. I thought, with defensive line being the biggest weakness heading into the offseason, I thought that they'd at least get two guys in the building. And, Deidrin Snott, loved that pick. He's going to be a star, I think, next to Grady Jarrett. But they're still thin. They still only have 3 true defensive tackles, NFL-caliber defensive tackles on the roster. And I thought, this class was deep enough in the middle to later rounds that they can get another guy, and there was plenty of options there sitting at 126, but they decided to prioritize running back. And if you're going to do that, you basically have to say that this is your Tevin Coleman insurance. They went out and they got Brian Hill last year. Brian Hill didn't work out, so now they doubled down on it this year and spent even a higher pick to get a guy who is their guy. For all intents and purposes, Ito Smith was the guy that they prioritized and then got him, as opposed to, Kalen Ballage or Chase Edmonds or some of the other guys that they've met with during the draft season. So if you're going to do that, I don't see how, unless you're going to do this shuffling where you sign Tevin Coleman and then dump Devontae Freeman in a year, and then you have Tevin and Ito Smith. But I just think, I've always thought Devontae Freeman's the more rounded running back and the better player. And, deservedly so. He got that big contract, the highest paid running back contract currently. So that just, to me, it seems like that's where their thought process is. So I just think Tevin Coleman's gone for all those reasons. So beyond him, Ricardo Allen's a guy you mentioned, and I've kind of been vocal that I don't know if that's going to be happening either, just because I love Ricardo. He definitely is one of the heart and souls of the defense, but not to be, overly critical, but I do think his skill set's replaceable, as opposed to a guy like Deion Jones or Keanu Neal, or even Vic Beasley. And I'm a big Vic Beasley fan, and I think he is going to have a bounce back year, and his contract is one that's going to be highly debated as well. So I would be more inclined to give a guy like Vic Beasley money than I would Ricardo Allen. Now, the one thing Ricardo does have going for him, I think, is the way this safety market is kind of deflated, and you've seen with some of these safeties that are still out in the market, Eric Reed, Kenny Vaccaro, Trey Boston, the safety position, I don't know if is as valued as maybe as it once was. So maybe that's going in the Falcons' favor, where Ricardo's not going to cost as much. But again, I think they've they drafted a guy, DeMonte Kasian, right from the get-go, said we're going to play him at free safety. So I kind of thought they had a plan right from the start, and it's still early in DeMonte's career to make a judgment call one way or the other. But I do think you can replace a guy like Ricardo and what he brings to the team as opposed to what Keanu or, like I said, Deion Jones or Vic Beasley bring to the team. So I would put Vic Beasley and Deion Jones and Keanu up there. I know, both of those guys still got 2 more years, but I think planning for their future contracts is more critical than planning for, the impending Ricardo Allen deal or Tevin Coleman deal.
Okay. To no one's surprise, I don't fully agree. I think the Tevin Coleman not being back, I think, that's probably a safe assumption at this point, but I don't necessarily, I think a lot can happen over the next 9 months that could sort of change the math on that. Certainly we'll sort of see what Devontae Freeman's durability looks like this season. I think if, he suffers another concussion this year, then I do think that immediately is going to make the Falcons much more willing to open up their wallets to keep Tevin Coleman in-house. I think with Ito Smith sort of being an insurance policy, I think Ito Smith is more of an I think the thing that's going to keep Tevin Coleman away out of Atlanta is if he gets paid, which is certainly a realistic possibility. But given sort of the running back market the last couple of years, I don't know if it's a guarantee. I know we just saw Jerick McKinnon get paid a lot of money, but when you sort of look at the other contracts that running backs have been paid the last couple of years, like McKinnon's deal really sort of stands out as far as free agents go. And really, when you look at like the guaranteed portion of that, it's a really low guarantee. So it's more of an inflated contract than what it really is. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I do think if Tevin Coleman hits that open market and then, teams are saying, okay, we'll give you like $5 million a year or $6 million a year as opposed to the $8 million a year that, if you're a free agent running back, you're angling for. I think that becomes a real possibility that the Falcons can realistically keep him at that point, because I think if you only have to pay him, basically a 2 or 3 year deal that's worth, 10 to 15 million, I don't see what would stop you from paying him just to sort of keep, arguably the best running back duo, if not number one, then number 2 best running back duo going for the next 2 or 3 years. I think the similar situation applies to Ricardo Allen. I think, while you can certainly say that Ricardo Allen as an athlete and as a playmaker is not a elite skill set, but I do think he is a leader and has proven himself to be a leader in this locker room the last couple of years. And I don't think the Falcons are going to be eager to sort of kick him out the door. And I think, as you say, with the sort of deflated safety market, I do think there's a realistic possibility they can sort of get him on sort of like what is essentially a 2 year deal that's maybe worth 12 or 13 or something like that, million or something like that. And I think that's going to be a deal that's going to be very amenable for the Falcons, just so they can see sort of where, DeMonte Casey is at the end of his contract, as opposed to thrusting him into the starting lineup, as early as 2019 or something like that. Now, Casey could come out and really ball this season or this summer and make people think, okay, well, maybe it is time to push Ricardo Allen at the door. But I don't necessarily think that's something that the Falcons are eager to do. So I think both of those situations are things that they'll play by ear. I'm not as convinced as everybody else that Vic Beasley is a slam dunk to return. I think when you look at sort of what he could get on the open market, and based off of his production in recent years, I don't think he's anywhere close to being worth what he's going to get paid. And while I am a fan of Vic Beasley as a player, I think he's kind of okay as a pass rusher. I don't think he's anything special in that regard. I know that's crazy talk to a lot of people when you hear, when you see that he led the NFL in sacks 2 years ago, but I think he was, those numbers are very, very much inflated in a lot of ways. But I think unless he can turn in a really strong season this year, where we're talking like 8, 9, 10 plus sacks and 60 plus pressures, I think at that point you just kind of like, okay, we'll get the most out of Vic Beasley for the next 2 years, and then we'll let him walk. We'll get that 3rd round pick for him instead of paying him the 16, 17, 18 million that these top-end edge rushers, that someone's going to pay Vic Beasley, because someone paid Olivier Vernon that a couple of years ago. So someone's going to pay him that money. And I don't think it should be the Falcons. And I do think even though he is an amazing athlete and he is a good player, I think as far as his pass rushing ability goes, I kind of think he, at this point in time, again, I could certainly be singing a different tune at the end of the season, but I think unless he can have that level of production this year, I think his skill set is a lot more replaceable than a guy like Ricardo Allen.
Yeah, I mean, we'll never probably agree on that. Just because I don't think you can easily find the level of athlete that Vic Beasley is along the edge. I mean, so basically, you're saying Ricardo Allen is worth more to the team because of leadership abilities? Is that? I mean, that's kind of what I got from that, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Because I'm trying to wait. I'm hoping that guys like Deion Jones, Grady Jarrett, I'm waiting for those guys to step up, and that was kind of what I was waiting this past season, and kind of Ricardo became that guy during that 3-3 stretch or whatever it was early in the season. I'm hoping that Deion Jones and Keanu Neal, even, I mean, he was named the chief, with the term that they used to stipulate a captain. I want those guys to be the captains, and I think, I mean, it's good that Ricardo is being that guy right now, but I think he's kind of just the stopgap there, because again, the core of this defense, I don't think you put Ricardo's name in there. The core of this defense is Deion Jones, Grady Jarrett, Keanu Neal, and Desmond Trufant's kind of the quiet type of lead. He's not that type of guy. I mean, he does it with his play on the field. Robert Alford's not necessarily that guy. So those three guys, I think, should and can provide the leadership going forward. So if you're just making the argument that Ricardo should be signed for that, I'm not sure that that's good use of money either. I mean, I get what you're saying about Vic Beasley being kind of a one-trick pony and maybe not, that great of a pass rusher right now, or hasn't shown it yet. But pass rushers are premium players, and as you said, I mean, teams are going to pay for that. And Falcons really, outside of John Abraham for the previous 10 or so years, haven't really had a guy in the building. Now they have two potentially, in Vic and Tack, and they work off of each other, whereas Tack's the bully and Vic is obviously the speed guy. So I'd be hesitant to let that go. I understand he had a down year. I think a lot of that had to do with the hamstring and then being pressed into different roles that kind of he wasn't prepared for, and he kind of just had to make the best of it. And I know you're a big fan of him at linebacker, but I think he was brought in to just go after the passer, pin his ears back, and use that speed. And hopefully we get to see that more from a healthy Vic Beasley.
Hopefully. I hope to be very wrong about Vic Beasley. I hope that he makes leaps and bounds as a pass rusher this year. And, people can throw this podcast or in any other tweets or podcasts I've said that sort of question that ability in him in my face. I'll happily eat that crow. I just, I look at it like, I think playing single high safety is a hard job, right? And I think, I think whether KZ makes that leap this year, I think will tell us just how hard it is. And I think when you look at Ricardo Allen and you sort of see, you're right. I don't think, is he one of the 5 or 6 best defensive players on the Falcons? No. But as like the 7th or 8th guy, I think he's really good. And I think comparatively to what other guys you're going to have to pay that are higher up there, I think he's going to be he's going to give you a lot more bang for your buck than certainly, I think, at this point, again, assuming that Vic Beasley doesn't make significant progress, you're going to pay twice as much money to keep Vic Beasley as you are to keep Ricardo Allen, in my opinion, if not more than twice as much money. And to me, if you're asking me, would I rather have Ricardo Allen for the next 2 years at $7 million a year, or would I rather have Vic Beasley for the next 3 or 4 years at 15 or 16 million a year? I'm taking Ricardo Allen. I don't see a difference between paying Ricardo Allen that type of money than paying a guy like Mohamed Sanu, when I think Ricardo Allen brings a lot more to this roster than what Sanu brings to this roster. And so, I think, as far as stabilizing your defense, if you're going to build for the future, I think keeping Ricardo Allen, I won't necessarily say he's a critical component of that, but I think he's much more critical than some of these other players like a Vic Beasley at this current point. So I think Allen is definitely a candidate. I think, again, I'm not going to sit here and be like, the Falcons should definitely resign him. It depends on what happens over the next 9 months, what Casey does, what Allen does, what other players do. And then at that point, then, I think the Falcons can make an educated guess or an informed decision, I guess. But, some of these other guys that are out there that could replace Ricardo Allen, like I remember liking a certain Saints safety by the name of Marcus Williams a lot last year. And, we sort of saw what Marcus Williams did this past year. Had a good rookie season, didn't necessarily end in the best of ways. And I just think, people thinking that you can just sort of go out there and replace Ricardo Allen by, the low-hanging fruit is out there for to replace and upgrade that position. I'm not as sort of on board with that sort of thought process. I certainly think there is room to improve that position, but I think if you're going to do so, you're going to have to use a first-round pick, a top 50 pick, which I think, at this current time, that sort of capital should be devoted to replacing, potentially supplanting guys like Vic Beasley or adding another pass rusher alongside Grady Jarrett or, getting a top-end offensive lineman. So if re-signing Ricardo Allen means that I don't have to use a top 50 pick on a safety for the next 3 or 4 years, that to me is well worth it.
I mean, we did just use a 16th overall pick or 17th overall pick a couple years ago on a safety, and it turned out well. So I think this team's at a position where so many starting spots are pretty much, filled up long term for the most part. I mean, obviously we got impending contracts, but you're looking at a scenario where there's, you look at what spot needs to be upgraded in the draft. You mentioned interior pass rusher is probably the only one that I think can come to mind. I mean, I can very easily see in 2019 Falcons kind of go best player available, and while safety might not be a need, it ends up being the pick, just like we saw with wide receiver. It was a need, but it wasn't a pressing need, and they just ended up taking best player available. This roster's in that type of position where you can take the best player available. And I think free safety might be in the discussion come next year, just because of the fact that Dan Quinn has added athletes to every single position on this defense, and free safety is kind of the last one remaining, more or less. And I'm also saying this stuff with Vic Beasley in mind, that, I've gone on record saying a healthy Vic Beasley, a healthy Takk McKinley, I think both of those guys are getting 10 sacks this year. And just like you, I mean, if it doesn't happen, you guys can throw those tweets, throw those declarations in my face. That's fine. But I truly think that tandem, mixed with Grady Jarrett continuing to progress, mixed in with Deidre Sanat, mixed in with, Jack Crawford, Derek Shelby rushing from the interior. I think, it's not there yet, but that's a good enough rotation where Vic Beasley's now not the only guy you have to worry about, which I think early on in his career, that slowed him down a bit. And now, I think people are going to sleep on him a little bit, and he's going to take you by surprise with that speed. So, I'm saying that all with mind that I have a crystal ball that I'm seeing Vic Beasley get 10 sacks this coming year. And if that's the case, I think that's hard to just throw away just because, money reasons, or you don't think he's as well-rounded of a pass rusher as you might get from someone else, maybe in the draft or in free agency.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I was looking at the matchups that he was going to have this year, and I basically came to the conclusion that if basically based off of the matchups and assuming Vic Beasley plays all 16 games, if he's really worth anything as a pass rusher, he should have no issues getting 9+ sacks and probably 55+ pressures. And so I agree with you. He should definitely have 10+ sacks because if he doesn't get that type of production, then he's kind of not that good. Not to say that he's bad, but it's just he's just closer to an average, slightly above average pass rusher than, say, a quote-unquote good pass rusher that I think a lot of people want and expect him to be. So that'll be the interesting sort of development and story to see this upcoming season with his pass rush. I don't 100% agree with you that the Falcons don't really have holes that they have to fill. I think there's a lot roster spots that have the potential that will have to need revamping over the next year or so. I think, while we sit here and say some of the Falcons picks this year are sort of best player available, I do think a lot of like wide receiver and cornerback, if they didn't address them this year, they would have been top priorities next year. So I do feel like they're not really doing their best player available strategy. It's more of we're just drafting the guys a year ahead than we need them necessarily. And so I do think that if that continues into next year, I do think there's a number of positions where the Falcons could wind up using high picks again, depending on how this draft goes. As I said earlier, 80% of your offensive line probably will have to be replaced in the next 2 years. You look at the tight end position, running back position. If Tevin Coleman walks and Devontae Freeman's one concussion away from retiring, I think whether or not Ito Smith is going to be the sort of guy that you trust to step in and be the lead dog in a running back by committee system. Who knows? Again, time will tell. I think the defensive line needs addressed. Again, I'm not as convinced that Vic Beasley's a long-term piece here. So I think if you're going to replace him, that's going to use a high priority position. Devondre Campbell might walk in 2 years. Who knows if Duke Riley's going to be ready by then? I hope he is. I expect him to be, but who knows if he's going to be the guy that's going to be able to step in. And then you have Ricardo Allen. Questions about that with him and Casey. So I do think there's a lot more potential for roster turnover over the next year or so than it seems to think that you seem to be letting on. But we'll sort of see how that happens. Again, a lot of that depends on how well certain players play this year. And so I do wonder a little bit about sort of whether it's the lesser of two evils to keep a guy like a Ricardo Allen long term. All right. And on that note, let's continue to where the more immediate roster moves are and roster holes are. I'm curious, sort of, you seem to have touched upon the possibility that the Falcons may need another defensive tackle. There are a number of notable names out there in the free agent market. Terrell McClain, they've been linked to. The Chiefs just cut Raheem Nunez-Roches today. We know Jonathan Hankins got cut earlier this offseason. Everybody's favorite nose tackle from the University of Houston, Joey Mbu, is also available. You've got guys like Carl Klug, Cedric Thornton, among others. Any of those names stand out, or any other positions that you look at the Falcons roster currently where you would like to see them addressed before training camp starts?
So Terrell McClain has kind of been, my flavor of the month thus far, and a D tackle that I think would be a great fit here. I think the reason why he didn't have much success in Washington, it just wasn't the right schematic fit for him. They run a 3-4. He's more of an attacking 4-3 nose tackle, and the Cowboys people that I follow on Twitter seem to have been big fans of him when he was there from 2014 to 2016. And, McClain is going back to visit them starting tomorrow and Thursday. So, chances are maybe they'll get a deal done right away just based off familiarity. And, as always the case with guys that I want in free agency, it doesn't seem to happen in Atlanta. So I'm not getting my hopes up. But if he does make it to Flowery Branch and gets a visit, I would hope they'd put the full court press on him. They met with him last year, and it didn't work out. So we'll see the second time around. But I think he would be a great one tech to rotate in with Dejan Sanat so that you wouldn't have to put the full burden on him to start. I mean, at the very least, I think Ataba Rubin is likely on speed dial if that's their kind of last resort. And I think they do need to add a one tech. That's probably priority number one, is add another body at that one tech spot. As far as the rest of the roster goes, I would probably say linebacker. I mean, right now it looks like they got 5. I'd be more comfortable if they had a 6th person. Leroy Reynolds, Sean Weatherspoon, much like Ataba Rubin, I feel like they're on speed dial as the last resort options. I'm not too sure other free agent names out there that would really make sense. So I think I wouldn't rule out Leroy coming back, especially to keep that, chemistry and continuity on special teams. I think that would serve as a good dual purpose signing. And And then lastly, our favorite position that we all love to talk about is the fullback spot. Obviously, right now, I guess they're going to see what they got with some of these undrafted rookies in rookie mini camp this weekend, and maybe go from there before they decide to bring back. I would say Derek Coleman. There's a very real chance to bring him back again. Special teams continuity, I think, is the first reason you would consider bringing him back, and then hopefully, maybe he'd make some strides second year in the offense. It's something we're hoping for Sark to do. So why not hope that Derek Coleman maybe can do the same from a blocking standpoint. But I mean, there are some intriguing options with these undrafted guys. I think there's a very real chance you could end up seeing one of these guys stick. I mean, after all, Patrick DeMarco was an undrafted free agent that kind of just became a Pro Bowler. Am I right? So maybe a guy like Daniel Marks from Stanford is someone that's, a guy that's blocked for Christian McCaffrey and Bryce Love these last 2 years. I need to watch a little bit more of him. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find any more film on him, but he jumped out at me a couple times. And then the other guy I like is Jake Rowe. He's not a prototypical fullback, but from an H-back standpoint, a guy that can give you a different look and be more of a threat in the pass game. But also, I mean, he gets after it as a blocker. Would I be 100% comfortable with him as a lead blocker? I'd be hesitant, but I like the fact I kind of want to see this team go to the more H-back type role, maybe keep 4 tight ends rather than maybe the true fullback, but still show that look every now and then. So we'll see what they end up doing there, but I wouldn't be surprised if Derek Coleman's the day one fullback when they open the season in Philly again.
Okay. I think with the D tackle, I think they need a 3-tech more than a 1-tech. I think they need a guy that can play those base downs at that 3-tech spot beside Deidre Sinat. I think they need to do what they can to keep Grady Jarrett as fresh as possible. So I think looking more for a 3-tech guy that can sort of fill that spot. There's a number of guys out there. I don't really care who they sign, but as long as they sign somebody, I'll be happy. Or probably I'll be happy, you know me. I think in terms of the other roster positions, we'll see. The fullback position is an interesting position to me. I think of the guys that they picked up, I think probably Daniel Marks is the best one, but I don't think Daniel Marks is very good. The interesting thing about Patrick DeMarco is, and I think this is an underrated aspect of sort of this fullback position, is like fullbacks don't necessarily come into the league and hit. Even a guy like the Falcons, that were reportedly interested in this offseason, a guy like Keith Smith, sort of sat around in Dallas for 2 or 3 years before he really sort of solidified himself as a competent fullback that the Falcons would have been getting this past year had they signed him rather than the Oakland Raiders. You look at a guy like DeMarco, who came into the league, really didn't stick until, he came to Atlanta in his 3rd year in the NFL, played well in his 2nd year down the stretch in Kansas City. But even going into DeMarco's 5th season, when he was competing with Colin Mooney, and a lot of Falcons fans thought him and Colin Mooney were equals, or if not Mooney being better, like he really didn't really solidify his role until that 5th year. And I think the expectation, at least from my perspective, and I certainly could be wrong, wouldn't be the first time, but I think the expectation, it seems like there's a lot of people talking about this fullback competition and talking about it, I don't know, with a certain level of optimism, thinking that these guys that the Falcons have brought in are going to be better than Derek Coleman, which I don't understand because no one really hits the ground running as a fullback coming into the league. It takes years to develop that, and keeping one of these guys, maybe Daniel Marks like a Patrick DeMarco by year 4, year 5 is playing really well. But I don't think the Falcons really need a good fullback in 2022 or whenever that is. They need a good fullback in 2018, if you ask me. So we'll see how that situation goes. I'm not necessarily being like the Falcons better go out and get Derek Coleman. But at least with Derek Coleman, he's a known commodity. These other guys aren't. I know to some people that makes them a little bit more optimistic because they don't know that these guys are going to be bad, where they know that Derek Coleman is going to be bad. But I just kind of look at it as a big step in the wrong direction for the Falcons at that fullback position. I will certainly be eagerly awaiting to see if one of these guys surprises me. There's always some player or two or multiple players that I sort of like, he's a camp body, and then comes out and balls during the summer and looks really good, and sort of shuts me up there. But I'm not necessarily that optimistic that we're going to see that at the fullback position. And I think if I was to place bets right now, I think the Falcons, probably when we get through, a couple of preseason games, I think we're going to start hearing things like the Falcons are talking to teams about trades and whatnot for fullbacks. So we'll see how that sort of develops. But if I had to guess, I don't think the guy who's going to be lining up at fullback in week 1 for the Falcons is currently on the roster. That's my guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm team Derek Coleman. I think he's going to be back. The trades aspect, I mean, do you have any names of guys you think would even be on the market on the team?
I know Michael Burton didn't have a great year in Chicago. He had an awful year in Chicago. So I can imagine that the Bears might look at shopping him. Not off the top of my head, I'd have to do some research, but I'm sure there's a couple of guys out there that could wind up being cut, come August, or sort of on the roster bubble that a team might be willing to dump.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was definitely pushing. I remember when Michael Burton got cut, I was definitely last summer hoping that would happen through waivers, and Chicago beat us to it. So I wouldn't be opposed to that.
Okay. So let's jump into some of these mailbag questions. The first one comes from Evian Wordflu. I think we have roughly 9.3 million after June 1st when Levine is off the books. Do you see the Falcons doing anything more than filling the back end of the roster with a cheap veteran or two?
Yeah, not really. I mean, other than the guys that we kind of talked about, whether it's, Leroy Reynolds or Ataba Rubin, Derek Coleman on vet-min deals. I mean, probably the biggest name free agent you could see is like a Terrell McClain. Jay Bromley's a guy that I'm not sure why the market is so kind of soft on him. I know he's not a great player, but he's still young enough. He's an athletic D tackle. I think if he goes to the right spot, I mean they can feature him in the right way, kind of get his career maybe going, and I'd like to see Atlanta maybe kick the tires on him, but I haven't heard relatively anything about him, so I don't think he would cost a lot. Maybe that's the type of guy. I think to maybe, like you said, play that 3-tech next to Dejan Sanat in the base. But other than those type of names, I don't think you can expect like a Jonathan Hankins or anyone, big or to hit home, to hit Flowery Branch this summer.
Yeah, I think we'll see some low key signings if the Falcons wind up adding guys. I don't think we're going to get a big splash move. I don't think we'll see an Antonio Gates. Maybe if this Julio drama keeps going, maybe the Falcons will kick the tires on Des Bryant or somebody like that. No, I'm kidding, of course, but certainly that would make my summer much more fun. Just talking about that, but and as for the cap situation, I don't know, Matt, where you're sort of estimating their cap situation. I'm a little lower than 9.3. I think it's like closer to 8.7, but you might have a different number.
Yeah, so I was kind of just finished up my preliminary using just the top 51, and right now I have them at 5.58 million, and that's with the rookie contracts, with Matt Ryan's contract. So then adding Toilolo's 3.5, I have it a little over 9, but not quite 9.3. So kind of in the middle of your number and his number. So
okay, all right. Jalen Muhammad asks, thoughts on Anthony Wimbush? I kind of like him as a pass rusher. At least I think he should make the practice squad.
Yeah, this is one of the guys that intrigued me of the bunch. There's about 5 or 6 of the undrafted guys that I'm going to keep an eye on, and he's one of them. I think, he's maybe this year's JT Jones, where those two are going to go at it for potentially a practice squad spot or maybe even a fringe roster spot, depending on what they end up doing with how many edges they end up carrying. But yeah, I mean, he was fourth in the nation in sacks from Ball State last year, and he kind of, from the limited videos I've seen of him, kind of offers some bend and kind of looks like Tack McKinley a little bit. I think he wore number 98. He's got dreads. I mean, not the stereotype, but he does offer, similar type of, I think, burst and that Tack does. So we'll see. I mean, again, you got to temper your expectations, especially a guy coming from a MAC school undrafted, but someone that I'm going to be looking for, and yeah, like Jalen said, potentially could stick on the practice squad this year.
Okay, I haven't watched him, so I don't really have an opinion. I'll check him out at some point in the next 6 weeks. Fall of the Patriots at Luez Abraham asked, thoughts on Mark Ingram's suspension missing the Falcons game? Have any of you watched any tape on Deidre Sanat? If so, what can we expect? FYI, I really like that pick. Would another concussion or injury to free Devontae Freeman make him a trade option?
Yeah, so I think Ingram being suspended for PEDs for the first 4 games, that's big for the Saints. I tweeted, shortly after it happened, I think Ingram's more of a matchup problem for this Falcons defense than, Alvin Kamara is. I just think this defense, because they rely on their speed and flying to the ball and stuff and playing free, they can contain it. They can hold up against a guy like Kamara. I mean, Deion Jones is the perfect, eliminator, Alvin Kamara eliminator, you could say. But whereas a guy like Ingram, he's a pounder, he's a bruiser. Those types of running backs and running, plays and stuff, they give this defense, I think, some trouble, holding up in the trenches. And that's kind of why I wanted them to just, attack the middle of the defense. And I think Deidre's going to be a great addition there. I think, obviously his run defense is probably his biggest strength, just because he's a strong player at the point of attack, can control the line of scrimmage. So Ingram not being there, though, that's, I think that's huge in that regard. And, and just to segue into Sanat some more, I mean, Sanat was my favorite pick of this entire draft class. I just think his overall game, much like Grady Jarrett, there's very few weaknesses. I mean, like I alluded to, he is going to win more with power, but I think he's a very, his short area quickness is very underrated, and I think he will slip past blockers right off the snap at times and can be disruptive in the backfield and rushing the passer. So I'm really excited for what he's going to bring for the future, and to pair with Grady, I think that's going to be a dynamic 1-2 combo right in the interior of the defense. And then, I mean, you touched on the Freeman stuff quite a bit. I know he's had a couple. He had one concussion this past year, and then what, he had one in 2015, Tevin's rookie season. So I guess a third one. You never want to mess with head injuries, and that is something to worry about. But I never really thought of Devontae Freeman, especially, at least coming into this past season, I never really thought of Devontae as having durability concerns. But again, head injuries aren't something you want to mess with. So I'm sure precautions will be taken if that were to happen. But that's not something that's really been on my radar as far as worrying about Freeman long term.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because, he missed 2 games this past year dealing with that concussion. I imagine a third one in however many months, 36 months or 34 months or whatever it is, probably will cause him to miss more time than that. So that I think that's really the concern with Devontae Freeman. As for the Ingram suspension, the Sanat thing, I don't really have anything additional to add other than what Matt said. I think in terms of Freeman's future, no, I don't think a concussion or injury would make him a trade option, because I think if he has another sort of concussion or major injury where the Falcons would want to get rid of him, then his trade market would evaporate because nobody would want to take him on. When you actually look at his contract, the Falcons really can't trade him until like the 2020 season without incurring a significant cap penalty. So it's one of those things where at that point in time, the another team probably isn't going to take on $6+ million on a quote unquote, in this scenario, injury prone running back that's at the age of 28. So no, I don't think Devontae is really ever going to be a trade option for the Falcons. Really, at any point, I think at any point where the Falcons are willing to move on from him, other teams won't be willing to trade for him. So yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably see Devontae, whether he's the lead guy or part of the committee, probably play out pretty much at least the next 2 seasons in Atlanta. We'll sort of see where he is beyond that. He could certainly play another 3+ years in Atlanta and finish his career in Atlanta as one of the great running backs of all time, or he could be gone in 2 years as the Falcons sort of do what other teams have done, which is sort of have a revolving door of running backs, every 4 or 5 years, get somebody new to replace him. And around that time, it'll be about 4 or 5 years for Devontae being the lead guy, and on to the next one, whether that's Ito Smith or somebody currently not on the roster. We'll have to see about that. So, yeah. Okay. Evan Birchfield has a series of questions. So his first one is, apparently the Falcons considered going linebacker in terms of Rashad Evans in round 1 of the draft. What does this mean for Duke Riley?
Yeah, if it's true, I guess it's not a great sign for Duke Riley. I mean, I'm still frustrated with some of the Duke Riley takes that I see, and I guess this doesn't help it when you have information like this. I'm expecting big things from Duke Riley. I think he's going to be the day one, weak side linebacker starting next to Deion Jones, and my hope, my expectation is by week 5 or 6, say, I think people are going to forget about all those bad Duke Riley takes, or those Duke Riley takes are going to be a distant memory. I think there's a reason Atlanta selected him when they did in 2017. I think they saw a guy that's very similar to Deion Jones, plays just fast and free, sideline to sideline type linebacker, can excel in coverage. So I'm hoping there's something, or I'm hoping there's something that is not being said, that it doesn't exist. I don't know. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I think Duke Riley's fine. I think Duke Riley he's going to be the day one starter, and I think as far as this Evans discussion being a round 1 option, I don't know. I don't know if you can add any more if you actually think that there's something to this story, but I'm kind of at a loss for words. I would have been very surprised if they took a linebacker that high. I even said I didn't think linebacker was going to be in the discussion until at least round 4, and it turned out to be true. But I mean, this report kind of indicates that maybe they were thinking a lot sooner, and the guys that they wanted didn't really fall to them at their picks.
Yeah, I think it is somewhat baffling. At the time, I was sort of thinking when we first heard about Rashaan Evans and the Falcons sort of sniffing around guys like Leighton Vander Esch, sort of being baffled by that, given how much draft capital they had already invested in the linebacker position over the last 2 years. But by the time we got to draft day, I sort of kind of convinced myself that I would, while I wouldn't necessarily get the pick, I could understand why they would make the pick, because I think you could make a very strong argument that Rashaan Evans is just more talented than any linebacker the Falcons have, including Deion Jones. So, in this sort of best player available scenario, I can certainly understand why the Falcons may have been intrigued by him. But as far as what it means for Duke Riley, I don't know. Obviously it's not necessarily, when you take it at face value, it's not necessarily a vote of confidence for Duke Riley. But at the same time, I'm not willing to go into panic mode and being like, oh, this means that the team is out on Duke Riley or anything like that. I think we'll find out what Duke Riley is in 3 or 4 months. We'll find out in training camp. We'll find out once he starts, playing on the field in September. I think if you're looking for reasons why the Falcons are out on Duke Riley, yeah, you can certainly find reasons for that. I think if you're looking for reasons why the Falcons still have the utmost confidence in Duke Riley, you can find reasons for that. I don't necessarily think people should go too far into the hot takes right now when football games aren't being played. So I just think, when Duke Riley misses on that tackle in that preseason game against the Dolphins or whoever we play this summer, then by all means throw out your hot takes, as people often do, and we'll deal with it then. But until then, it's just kind of like, okay, we'll just wait and see where Duke Riley is. I think he'll be good, or I think he has the capacity to be good. Whether he actually lives up to that ability and that potential, we'll have to find out. But I don't necessarily know what any of this means for Duke Riley. I think ultimately that will be settled on the ball field.
I mean, I don't even know the reasons that you can be down on Duke Riley. Like, I know he over pursued a lot of tackles this year and consequently missed tackles because of it. But I think that's just a product of being a rookie and the game being very fast for him. And, with another year under his belt, the game will slow down and then he'll be able to use his speed to his advantage and make those tackles. And, anytime a rookie gets hurt, that's the worst thing that can happen to you because, right there just stunts your progression and stops it right there and you can't get the reps in practice. So, again, with a healthy Duke Riley and a year under his belt, offseason under his belt, and to know what to expect, I just think, he can be exactly the type of player that Deion Jones can be.
Yeah, I think ultimately, again, I think that's going to get settled on the field. So, I'm not going to necessarily put too much stock in anything Duke Riley did as a rookie because I do agree with you. I think a lot of his issues were because he was playing too fast. Dan Quinn likes it fast and physical, but the game was moving too fast for him, and he wasn't playing naturally. He was a little robotic in terms of not really understanding what he was supposed to be doing, which you often see with rookies. And I think there were reasons to be optimistic about his potential. I think certain elements of the game, not necessarily the playmaking elements of the game, but in terms of the technical aspects of the game, I thought he did. In some of those areas, he did a pretty good job last year, and certainly was doing a much better job in those areas than, say, Devondre Campbell and Deion Jones were during their rookie years. They just, I think made a lot more plays, and so it sort of masks that some of the technical aspects, the more detail-oriented aspects of playing the linebacker position, were not up to par with them in their rookie years. And I think, in a lot of cases, and I said this to somebody a couple of weeks ago with Duke Riley, where I think when you look at Devondre Campbell's performance as a rookie and Duke Riley's performance as a rookie, I don't see that much difference. Obviously, again, Campbell made a couple more sort of highlight reel plays with interceptions and pass breakups and whatnot, and a couple of big hits. But I think in a lot of ways, people have sort of retroactively mythologized how good Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell were as rookies. I think in large part because of how effective the team was. And I think oftentimes when it comes to sort of fans, and certainly we all sort of fall into this trap, is when the team wins, we get a more positive and optimistic shine on things, and we interpret things and see things from a more positive perspective. And when the team loses or is struggling, we see things from it tend to be a little bit more of a negative perspective. And I think because of the struggles of the team overall, and the fact that Duke Riley wasn't necessarily making these highlight reel plays, there's much more of a negative sheen on his rookie season versus the opposite with guys like Campbell and Jones as well. So I look at it from a situation where I don't necessarily think that, the difference in perception between those two guys is not as big as people like to make it out to be. Evan Birchfield's next question is, who do you think the Falcons DTs will be in Week 1?
Grady Jarrett, Deidrin Sanat, Jack Crawford, and probably a Taba Rubin. Hoping, maybe it's someone a little bit sexier, but probably it's unlikely. So Taba Rubin, and I think maybe Courtney Upshaw is going to be back. I know he visited the Eagles today, and I'm not sure. Maybe that's in response to Timmy Jernigan being on the shelf for a little bit. I'm not sure if they'll bring him in, but Versatile piece. Can play multiple positions on the line. He'd probably be a game day inactive, but I think he's a veteran body. You know what to expect from him. I wouldn't be opposed to him as well. But I think the 4 I'd probably stick with is Jarrett, Sanat, Crawford, and Rubin.
I'll go Jarrett, Crawford, Sanat, and a D tackle to be named later. I have no idea who it's going to be. Maybe it's a Terrell McClain. Maybe it's a Courtney Upshaw. Maybe it's somebody else. I have no idea. Maybe it's, they wind up calling up the Eagles and say, hey, send us Destiny Vio our way. Let's trade. We'll give you a 7th round pick for him. And they wind up doing something like that. So I don't know who it's going to be, but I don't expect it to be Garrison Smith or Justin Zimmer. I think Garrison Smith is he's decent. Like I watched him a little bit last year in Seattle. He was decent. He'd be a decent 5th D tackle. I think he's capable enough to make the team, but I don't necessarily know if I would trust him to be sort of being a regular in the defensive line rotation, which you need from that 4th guy who's going to probably play 20 plus snaps a game, which I don't necessarily know if he's ready for that sort of role. So I think they'll sign somebody or trade for somebody between now and the start of the regular season. Who that player is, I really have no idea. Really, ever since the draft where the Falcons threw a number of curveballs at us, like I'm getting out of the prediction business when it comes to what this team is going to do. So we'll see what happens. Evan Birchfield asks, give a way too early prediction on the Falcons' most improved player in 2018.
So I think on a previous show, we had a similar question. I went with Duke Riley for... I'll go with a different direction for this one, so change it up a little bit. I'm going to say Takk McKinley. I think Takk McKinley in his 2nd year could make a sizable jump. I thought, towards the end, we really saw him start to put it together. In the playoffs alone, had 2 sacks, finished with 8 total in 18 games, and he didn't play a lot of snaps either. So I think he's just scratching the surface, and I think year 2, we saw Vic Beasley make his jump in year 2. I think Takk McKinley can easily do it in year 2 as well. So, it's hard to find some options here because a lot of the Falcons players are well established. Austin Hooper might be one, but I'll go with Takk McKinley.
I'm going to go with Julio Jones because he'll actually score touchdowns this year. No, I don't know. Like, you could throw out Duke Riley, you can throw out Austin Hooper, you can throw out any number of players. Like, I don't know. But yeah, I do feel like we've answered this question recently. So, of the Falcons draft class, how many will make the roster?
Hopefully all of them. I think their draft record has been so good the last 4 years. I know Brian Hill is probably the only one that. Brian Hill made the roster, though, right?
I believe so. I think he was on the final 53.
Yeah. I think that trend's going to continue as well. I think they draft for specific needs. They know the roles that they're going to play their players in. And I think this class is no different. Calvin Ridley is going to be the wide receiver 3, in my estimation. Isaiah Oliver, while maybe not right from the start, I think you will see him mixed and matched in the nickel defense with Brian Poole. Deidre Sanat is going to be a fixture in the base and maybe in some sub-packages towards the end of the season. Ito Smith's the guy that he might not have a huge role, but I think he's definitely going to make it. You're going to see him on special teams. I think he's going to be the opening day kick returner, but that's kind of a dart throw prediction. We'll see about that. And then obviously Gage and Olakun, I think, will find roles on special teams early, and they'll be towards the bottom of the depth chart at their respective positions. But yeah, I believe all of them will make it.
Yeah, I'll be surprised if all of them don't make it. I think looking at it, I think Russell Gage is really the only guy that has a chance to not make it, just because I think the Falcons have enough depth at the wide receiver position, enough depth at the cornerback position that they don't necessarily need him to be a gunner, and can still get by. And there may be some other guys, particularly at that wide receiver position, that may just be as good as him on special teams, like a Justin Hardy, like a Marvin Hall, and may offer a little bit more immediate impact as a wide receiver. So I think he's probably the only guy that really, Foye Olakun, I wouldn't necessarily put too high expectations on his contributions this year, but I would be shocked if 2 or 3 undrafted rookie linebackers leapfrogged him between now and the start of the season. So I think Gage is really the only guy that's in danger of losing a spot, but I still think he's probably a very safe bet to make the team, just because all he really has to do is be a competent gunner and he'll make the roster. And that's not necessarily a low bar or a high bar that he has to clear. Special teams does matter, but he's not like he has to go out there and lead the team in receiving during the preseason for the Falcons to be like, well, we didn't bring you in to be a contributor as a wide receiver. We brought you in to be contributors on special teams, and that's something that over the course of several years at LSU he proved he can do. So there's no reason to think that he won't be able to do this so again at the NFL level. So, I think all of them will make the roster. And sort of on a similar note, he asked a question about, do you think Ito Smith will be on the roster? I think we just answered that. And Evan Birchfield's final question is, how many sacks will Jack Crawford have in 2018?
I'm going to say 2. I think he is going to see a fair amount of nickel. He's probably going to start in nickel next to Grady. I don't know if you feel the same way, but, I don't think, just for a reference, Dontari Poe had like 2.5 last year, but, he contributed close to 30-plus pressures. So I think that's hopefully, that's a high benchmark probably for Jack Crawford, but I think pressures is going to matter more for Jack Crawford than the ultimate sacks, and I don't think he's going to be a high sack guy ever or anything like that. So I think he can get 2 sacks. Hopefully, he can get 25-ish pressures. That would be a successful season in my opinion if Jack can get that.
Yeah, I think looking at I'm trying to look up his production last year. He played 3 games.
Yeah, 4 games, I think.
Yeah, he played basically 2 whole games and half of 2 other games. So, and then he had 3 hits and 4 hurries in those 3 or 4 games. You extrapolate that, multiply it by 4 or something like that. Then you're looking at, something like, I don't know, I can't do math in my head, 25, 30-ish sort of overall pressures. And, that's close to what Grady Jarrett had last year. I think, it's possible that he can get 3 or 4. I wouldn't expect it. If he does, I think it's going to be more of finishing off the play after Tack McKinley or Vic Beasley forces the quarterback up in the pocket, and he gets a bunch of sacks that way. I think he'll probably get more sacks if he, decides to send that signed football over to Evan Birchfield at some point. I don't think it's a coincidence that his season was cut short when he didn't ship that his way. So I think he needs to break that curse somehow. But yeah, I think probably I wouldn't put high expectations. Probably 2 or 3 is probably a reasonable assumption. I don't think he's had more than 3 or 4 in a season. So I wouldn't expect him to break that this year in Atlanta, even though I think he'll have probably more opportunities than we've seen in some of his recent seasons over in Dallas. But yeah, I think he'll probably be the go-to third down rusher. I think they'll mix in some Sanat if they wind up signing somebody halfway decent between now and the start of the season. I think that guy could sort of take some reps away from him. I wouldn't be totally shocked if the Falcons tinkered with moving Tack inside on a couple of times. He dabbled at that occasionally at UCLA. I think if you're looking at the Falcons' 4 best pass rushers on the team right now, I think it's Tack, Vic Beasley, Grady Jarrett, and Brooks Reed. So I think unless they make some substantial upgrades at that D tackle position or at that D end position between now and the start of the season, I do think, if the team is going to try to put their 4 best pass rushers on the field on occasion. And I won't necessarily think that's going to be a regular thing that we'll see in the nickel, but certainly maybe have those guys out there for 5 to 10 snaps. I could sort of see them kicking Tack inside and seeing what he can do as an interior rusher on occasion.
They had Brooks Reed tinker every now and then, I remember, at D tackle in the nickel. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, I don't know if you'd rather have Tack there. I mean, I feel like they're the same weight and all that, but because of Tack's, I don't know, the dog in him, maybe you could see him win more and be more successful in the interior than Brooks. But yeah, I'd be all for it. I mean, it's all about getting your best 4 pass rushers on the field, especially in 3rd and long situations. So I think that's definitely something that Dan Quinn might mess around with.
Yeah, I think Tack is a better fit inside because Brooks Reed, he can't do that spin move as well.
It's true.
If he's inside, there's not enough room to pull it off. And Tack's game is even though last year most of his production came off of using his sort of speed move. He's a much more powerful player, so I think that it typically can be a lot more effective against interior guards. And with his first step quickness, I think he can really sort of be a lot more disruptive inside than a guy like Brooks Reed, who's more of a quote unquote finesse pass rusher. I think I guess if Jack Crawford's out there listening, get that football signed, man. And then maybe we can double your sack total, and maybe you can make it 5 or 6 or something like that. And if you do, then I think it'll be well worth it. All right, Matt, I appreciate you coming on. Go ahead and plug your Twitter as well as any recent writings that you had at the Rise Up Reader or future writings that you plan on covering over the course of this summer.
Yes, on Twitter, you can follow me at Matt Karoly, MattKaroly. Catch my work at riseupreader.com. I wrote an article earlier this week about, I talked on a little bit on the show here about Ito Smith and how I think this 2018 draft class might be judged on his selection, just based off of him being Tevin Coleman's insurance and them kind of not double dipping on D tackle. So you can take a look at that, see what you think, throw some comments in there, and you can shoot me some comments on Twitter, and we can go back and forth on that. And as far as future work, I don't know. I mean, I'm putting together my own salary cap spreadsheet, so I'm thinking maybe I'll write something about some of these future contracts and how they might all fit and work together going forward. So maybe be on the lookout for that.
Okay. Well, Matt, we appreciate you coming on. Just want to let you guys know that because we're not going to necessarily be doing regular shows every week on this channel, we'll certainly keep you guys updated on Twitter and Facebook as well. This show, we were originally not going to do the show, but because of the Matt Ryan deal, figured it would be worthwhile talking a little bit more Falcons, just because this may be the only significant news we have for several weeks. But because of that, of this sort of off and on structure that we're going to have through the start of training camp until we get into August, there's going to be a lot more content on the Facebook page. That's Falcons Central Radio. You can find it on Facebook. And so what you'll see is more videos of myself, solo videos of myself and Scott on that page, in which we just spend a couple of minutes talking about a topic of the day. Maybe I got into an argument with Matt on Twitter, which you guys who follow us know is going to probably happen a lot in the coming days and months. And so maybe I'll just decide, you know what, I don't feel like arguing with Matt on this. I'll just say my piece on a Twitter video, on a Facebook video. And so if you guys want to make sure you catch all that content, then by all means, like our page on Facebook. Again, that's Falcons Central Radio. Of course, you can submit questions that way. Another way of submitting questions is using the hashtag Falcons Mailbag on Twitter. Of course, I am at Falcons. Scott is at Karasik S. Of course, the show's Twitter handle is Falcons PFC. Of course, follow PF Central as well to get all the updates. If you want to watch this show live on YouTube, then you need to subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page so that you never miss a live broadcast, as well as the Falcon Central Facebook page, so you can catch it on Facebook as well. So Okay. All right. So we just heard. If you're weirded out by us pausing, we just heard breaking news from our producer that David Cantor, the agent for Jack Crawford, is going to get that football over to Evan Birchfield sooner rather than later. So, any hope that you guys had that Jack Crawford would have another down season, another injury-plagued season, that is off the board because the agent is now on top of it. So, we'll see. Evan, congratulations! You're finally getting that football after what now 14 months of waiting. So, I guess good things come to those who wait. So, once again, thanks, Matt, and to all you guys listening or watching us. We'll see you guys at some point when the next interesting thing happens. But again, check out those videos on Facebook, and you'll certainly stay up to date with our thoughts on the Falcons.